Police officers harassed me and violated me. They didn't know I was a lawyer recording them. I stumbled into the police station still shaking from being robbed at knife point 20 minutes earlier. My dress torn from when the attacker grabbed me. Mascara streaked down my face. But the desk sergeant rolled his eyes the moment he saw my cocktail dress and heels, already deciding that my assault was my fault. "Let me guess," he said before I could speak. "You were drunk, flashing yourself to men at a bar, then got surprised when someone followed you out?" When I tried to explain I'd been walking from my car to my apartment, he cut me off. "Sure you were. In that dress? At this time of night? In that neighborhood? You were looking for something and found more than you bargained for." He called over Officer Harris, who looked me up and down slowly before speaking. "What were you really doing out there? Working? We know what girls in dresses like that do in that area." When I said I lived there, he laughed. "Right. You live there. How many clients do you see a night?" I tried to explain again about the robbery, but he interrupted. "Was it really robbery, or did someone just not pay you what you expected?" They made me wait 2 hours before taking my statement, letting every drunk person who came in go ahead of me. When Officer Harris finally brought me back, he said, "You've sobered up enough to tell the truth now?" I told him I hadn't been drinking, and he leaned in close enough that I could smell his coffee breath. "I can smell the wine on you. How many drinks did you really have? 3? 4? More?" When I described the attacker, Officer Mitchell joined us and said, "So you got a good look at him? In the dark? While you were terrified? Or are you making up details now?" He turned to Harris. They always remember more than they could have seen, trying to make themselves sound credible. I showed them the cut on my arm from the knife, and Mitchell said, "That could be self-inflicted. We've seen girls do worse for attention." Harris asked what I was wearing for the report, then added, "That dress is basically an advertisement. You can see everything. What did you expect walking around like that?" Mitchell chimed in, "It's like leaving your car unlocked with cash on the dashboard. You're asking for trouble." When I said that wasn't relevant, Harris said, "Everything's relevant when you're dressed like you're for sale." They asked for my phone to check for evidence, and started scrolling through my photos. Lots of party pictures here, different guy in each one. "You sure one of your boyfriends didn't just get rough?" Mitchell showed Harris a beach photo. "Look at this one. She definitely likes attention. Probably made the whole thing up when someone didn't give her enough." When I insisted on filing a report, Mitchell said, "You know filing a false report is a crime, right? If we find out you're lying about any of this, you'll be the one in handcuffs." Harris added, "We've had girls like you before. Make up stories when their night doesn't go as planned. When the drugs wear off, they regret their choices and cry robbery." Harris stood up and walked around me slowly. "Stand up. Turn around. I need to see if your story matches your injuries." When I stood, he said, "That dress is so tight I can see you're not hiding any defensive wounds. Usually real victims fight back. You don't have a scratch except that little cut." He made me turn in a full circle while he narrated to Mitchell about how untraumatized I looked. Mitchell grabbed my purse and dumped it out. "Let's see what you're really carrying. Condoms? Paraphernalia?" He found my work ID tucked in a pocket but didn't look at it, just tossed it aside. "Pepper spray? But you didn't use it? Sure you weren't just meeting someone you knew? Maybe the transaction went bad?" He pocketed the $20 from my wallet. "Evidence." Harris leaned back and said, "Here's what really happened. You were out looking for a good time, maybe selling yourself, maybe just drunk and stupid. Someone took advantage of your bad decisions. That's not robbery, that's consequences." Mitchell nodded. "We could arrest you for public intoxication, solicitation, maybe drug possession if we search you properly, or you can stop wasting our time with this fake report." I finally pulled out my actual business card and placed it on the table. "No, here's what really happened. I'm a prosecutor with the DA's office. I've been recording this entire interaction from the moment I walked in." I showed them my phone displaying the recording app running for the past 2 hours and 17 minutes. "Every single word you've said is on tape." Both officers went completely gray, their mouths hanging open as they stared at the logo on my card. I held up my phone and turned the screen toward them, showing the recording app still counting up the seconds. The red recording dot pulsed steadily as the timer showed 2 hours, 17 minutes, and 43 seconds. Harris's face went from gray to white as he watched the numbers tick upward. Mitchell's hand started moving toward my phone like he was going to grab it. His fingers got within inches before he froze, realizing that snatching evidence from a prosecutor would make everything worse. Harris pushed back from the table so hard that his chair tipped backward. The metal legs scraped against the floor before the whole thing crashed down behind him. The sound echoed through the small interview room like a gunshot. Mitchell jumped at the noise and his knee hit the underside of the table. My purse items scattered across the surface rattled from the impact. I stood up slowly, keeping my phone visible in my hand the whole time. Neither officer moved or said anything as I started gathering my things from the table. My work ID went back in my purse along with my pepper spray and wallet. Mitchell had left the $20 bill sitting next to his notepad. I picked it up and put it back in my wallet while both officers watched. Harris stayed frozen next to his fallen chair while Mitchell sat completely still. I told them I needed to get medical attention for my injuries now. My voice came out steady even though my legs felt shaky underneath me. I walked to the door and neither of them tried to stop me. The hallway outside the interview room was empty except for the buzzing fluorescent lights. I could hear voices from the main area of the station as I walked toward the exit. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone to text Bianca while walking. The message was simple, but my fingers kept hitting the wrong letters. I had to delete and retype it 3 times before getting it right. At police station. Was robbed. Officers harassed me. Have full recording. Leaving now. The main area of the station had gotten busier since I'd been in the interview room. Several officers looked up as I walked past the front desk. The desk sergeant who'd been so dismissive earlier wouldn't meet my eyes. I pushed through the heavy glass doors into the parking lot. The cold night air hit my face and I realized I'd been sweating. My car was parked under a streetlight 3 rows back. I got in and locked the doors immediately before doing anything else. The recording was still running on my phone, so I stopped it and saved the file. My hands moved fast as I opened my cloud storage apps. I uploaded the audio file to Google Drive first, watching the progress bar slowly fill. Then I opened Dropbox and uploaded it there too as backup. While those uploaded, I attached the file to an email and sent it to my work account. The file was huge, so it took forever to send. I sat there for 5 full minutes making sure everything saved properly. Through my windshield, I could see the station's front windows. Harris and Mitchell were visible inside, standing near the desk sergeant's area. They were having what looked like an intense conversation with lots of hand gestures. Harris kept pointing toward the parking lot while Mitchell shook his head. The desk sergeant had his arms crossed and looked angry. I started my car but didn't drive away yet. Instead, I called the station's main number and asked to speak with Watch Commander Leo Barnett. The receptionist put me on hold for a minute before coming back. She said Commander Barnett wasn't available right now. I hung up and called Bianca's cell phone instead. It went straight to voicemail, so I left a detailed message. My voice cracked partway through describing what Harris and Mitchell had done. I had to pause and take a breath before continuing. I explained about the recording and that I'd already backed it up. 10 minutes later, my phone rang and Bianca's name appeared on the screen. Her voice was tight with anger when she asked if I was okay. I told her about the robbery first, then the harassment at the station. She interrupted to ask if I was hurt, and I mentioned the cut on my arm. She told me to go straight to the emergency room right away. Get a full exam, she said. Tell them you need Jade Hudson if she's working tonight. Bianca said she'd meet me at the hospital and handle everything with the department. I put the car in reverse but noticed movement near the station entrance. 2 officers had come outside and were watching my car. One started walking toward the parking lot, so I quickly backed out of my spot. As I drove toward the exit, the officer raised his hand like he wanted me to stop. I rolled down my window just enough to hear him. "You can't leave yet," he called out. I told him I wasn't under arrest and had the right to seek medical care. He stood there as I drove past him onto the street. The hospital was only 10 minutes away, but it felt longer. I kept checking my mirrors to see if anyone was following me. The emergency room was busy when I walked in. The triage nurse took my information and had me wait with everyone else. 20 minutes later, they called me back to an exam room. Jade Hudson introduced herself as the SANE nurse and explained what she needed to do. She photographed the cut on my arm from multiple angles with a special camera. Then she documented the bruising on my upper arm where the robber had grabbed me. The marks were turning purple and yellow already. She measured each bruise with a small ruler and wrote notes on a chart. Her hands were gentle as she cleaned the cut and put a fresh bandage on it. I felt disconnected from my body as she worked, like I was watching someone else get examined. She took photos of my torn dress and the dirt on my knees from where I'd fallen. Everything got labeled and put into evidence bags, even though this was for the robbery, not the harassment. My whole body felt heavy and exhausted as she finished the documentation. The door opened and Bianca walked in wearing jeans and a sweatshirt instead of her usual suit. She looked at my bandaged arm and the evidence bags on the counter and her jaw tightened. Jade stepped out to give us privacy and Bianca sat down in the plastic chair beside me. I pulled out my phone and found the recording file, my fingers still shaking a little as I hit play. Harris's voice filled the small room asking about how many clients I see a night. Bianca's face got harder with each word coming through the speaker. She pulled out a legal pad from her bag and started writing fast, her pen pressing hard into the paper. When Mitchell's voice said I was dressed like I was for sale, she paused the recording and asked if I was okay to continue. I nodded and she hit play again. The part where they dumped my purse and took my $20 made her write even faster. She kept pausing to note specific timestamps and policy violation codes. When we got to the part where I revealed my business card, she stopped the recording completely. She said she'd heard enough for now and we'd go through the rest tomorrow. The clock on the wall showed 1:47 a.m. when we walked out to the parking lot together. Bianca gave me a tight hug and told me to call if I needed anything before morning. I sat in my car for a while after she drove away. The parking lot lights made everything look yellow and strange. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, so I called my best friend even though it was so late. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice thick with sleep. I told her I was okay but had a rough night at work. She stayed on the phone with me for 20 minutes just talking about normal things until my breathing steadied. The drive home took longer than usual because I kept checking my mirrors. Every set of headlights behind me made my stomach tighten. When I finally got to my apartment building, I sat in the car for another 5 minutes before going inside. The next morning came too fast after only 3 hours of sleep. I drove to the Internal Affairs office downtown and filled out form after form at a metal desk. The intake officer was an older woman with reading glasses on a chain. When I mentioned I had a complete audio recording of the incident, she looked up from her computer screen. She assigned me case number IA7829 and said someone would contact me within 2 business days. Her fingers typed fast as she entered my statement into the system. Before I left, she gave me a receipt with the case number and told me to keep it safe. My phone rang as I walked back to my car and Matthew Kramer introduced himself as the Internal Affairs investigator assigned to my case. He wanted to schedule a formal interview for the next business day at 10 a.m. He said the recording would need to be preserved as evidence and asked if I had backups. I told him about the cloud uploads and he said that was smart thinking. He gave me his direct number and said to call if anything else happened. That evening I stopped at the hardware store and bought new deadbolts for my apartment door. The robber had only gotten my wallet, not my keys, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being unsafe. The locksmith took an hour to install everything while I sat on my couch trying not to think about the night before. When I went to throw my clothes in the hamper, seeing my torn dress made my chest go tight. The fabric was ripped right where the robber had grabbed me. My breathing got fast and shallow, and I had to sit down on the bathroom floor. I pressed my back against the cool tile wall and counted to 10 over and over until the room stopped spinning. The dress went straight into the trash after that. Walking into the DA's office the next morning felt different. People looked at me and then quickly looked away. Conversations stopped when I walked past. Someone had obviously heard something about what happened. I made it to my desk and started checking emails but couldn't focus on the words. Bianca appeared at my cubicle and asked me to come to her office. She closed the door behind us and pulled the blinds shut. She said word was getting around about the incident and there might be pressure from above to let it go. The police union had connections everywhere and they protected their own. She wanted me to know she'd support whatever I decided, but I should be prepared for pushback. My phone buzzed that afternoon with a text from a number I didn't recognize. It just said, "Careful what you say next." I took a screenshot immediately and forwarded it to both Matthew and Bianca. Matthew called me 5 minutes later and said he'd try to trace the number. Then he told me something that made my stomach drop. The security cameras at the police station were supposedly down for maintenance during my visit. We both knew that was too convenient since I hadn't planned to be there. Someone was already trying to cover their tracks. The next day, Human Resources called me into a meeting about reassignment. They said the DA's office needed to put up a conflict wall between me and any cases involving Officers Harris or Mitchell. I was moved to the appeals division effective immediately. It was technically a lateral move, but everyone knew it meant being sidelined from real trial work. They said it was for my own safety and to preserve case integrity. I packed up my trial files and moved to a smaller office on the 3rd floor. That afternoon, I had an appointment with Tanner McBride, a civil rights attorney Bianca had recommended. His office was in an old building downtown with creaky floors. He listened to portions of the recording and took notes about federal civil rights violations. He explained I had strong grounds for a lawsuit under Section 1983 for deprivation of rights. The case could take years but might be the only way to get real accountability. He said to think about it and call him when I was ready to move forward. Back at my apartment that night, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and started organizing everything. I pulled up my phone's cloud backup and downloaded every text message, call log, and photo from the past week. My hands moved fast across the keyboard as I created a spreadsheet with columns for date, time, and what happened. Each row got filled with details like when I left work, when the robbery happened, when I walked into the station. I copied the recording file to 3 different cloud services and emailed it to myself at 2 different addresses. The work kept my mind busy and stopped me from thinking too much about what happened. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number that said, "I'm a patrol officer at the same precinct and saw what happened to you." The message continued saying she'd witnessed Harris do similar things before and wanted to help. She signed it Rosa Talley and suggested we meet at a coffee shop downtown tomorrow morning. I texted back agreeing to meet at 9 and saved her number. The next morning I checked a police forum website someone had told me about and saw a new post titled, "Drunk ADA makes false claims after DUI stop." The post claimed I'd been pulled over for drunk driving and tried to use my position to get out of it. It said I made up the whole robbery story when that didn't work. My face got hot reading the lies, but I took screenshots of everything. This was exactly what Bianca had warned me about. I forwarded the screenshots to her and she called me 10 minutes later. She said she was scheduling a meeting with the police chief that afternoon to formally notify him about the recording and demand an investigation. She wanted everything documented through official channels, even though we both knew how these things usually went. The chief would promise to look into it, and then try to bury it. I met Rosa at the coffee shop and she looked nervous, checking over her shoulder before sitting down. She told me Harris had at least 3 other complaints from women, but they all got sealed or dismissed. She'd tried reporting him once but got told to mind her own business. She gave me dates and names she remembered. Writing them on a napkin, she slid across the table. I thanked her and promised to keep her name out of it as much as possible. 2 days later, I had my formal interview with Matthew Kramer from Internal Affairs. We sat in a small conference room while I played the entire recording on my phone. He took notes the whole time, pausing to ask me to replay certain parts. When Mitchell's voice said he was taking my $20 as evidence, Matthew wrote something and underlined it twice. After hearing Harris make me turn in a circle, he shook his head and wrote more notes. When the recording ended, he counted up the violations on his notepad. He said there were at least 7 policy violations, including conduct unbecoming an officer, failure to follow victim protocols, and theft. He'd need to interview the officers, but my recording gave him everything he needed to move forward. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I kept replaying everything in my head over and over. At 3 in the morning, I finally texted Bianca asking for the therapist referral she'd mentioned. She texted back the contact info for someone who specialized in trauma from both crime victims and people mistreated by police. I called first thing in the morning and got an appointment for that afternoon. The therapist's office was in a quiet building with soft lighting and comfortable chairs. She introduced herself and said Bianca had given her the basic situation. She taught me a grounding technique where I name 5 things I can see, 4 I can hear, 3 I can touch, 2 I can smell, and 1 I can taste. We practiced it together when I started feeling panicked talking about the robbery. She said both the attack and the harassment were traumatic, and my reactions were completely normal. She gave me homework to practice the grounding technique twice a day. The next week, Matthew called to warn me that the police union had hired a lawyer who was already spreading a story. The lawyer claimed I'd been drinking heavily, and the officers were just doing their job investigating a suspicious person. He said this was standard union tactics to muddy the water and make everything seem less clear. The lawyer was demanding to see my medical records from the hospital to prove I was drunk. Matthew said not to worry because the recording spoke for itself. but it still made me mad that they were trying to flip everything around. The hospital called that afternoon about my lab results from the exam. The nurse said everything came back normal with no drugs or unusual substances in my system. My blood alcohol was 0.0, which proved I hadn't been drinking despite what the officers claimed. The only issue was that the results were from hours after the incident, so the union lawyer would probably say I'd sobered up by then. It was frustrating that even with all my evidence, they could still try to twist things. Tanner called me the next day saying he was sending preservation letters to the police department. These legal documents required them to keep all records, emails, and communications about my case. He was also preparing subpoenas for Harris and Mitchell's phone records and department emails. He wanted to see if they'd texted each other about me or talked to other officers about covering things up. The legal process was starting to move forward even though it would take months or maybe years to finish. 3 days later, I noticed the same dark sedan in my rearview mirror on my way to work. Then again when I left for lunch and once more when I drove home. The windows were tinted so I couldn't see the driver, but the license plate started with 7G4 and had a small dent in the rear bumper. I took different routes the next 2 days and the car kept showing up, always staying 2 or 3 cars behind me. On the third day, I drove straight to a different police station across town and walked inside with my phone already recording. The desk officer there, a woman with short gray hair, listened to my whole story without interrupting and wrote down the plate number I'd memorized. She told me she'd put extra patrols near my apartment building and gave me her direct number in case I saw the car again. 2 days later, Rosa texted asking if we could meet somewhere private to talk about my case. We picked a coffee shop 20 minutes outside the city where nobody from the department would see us. She arrived wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap, checking over her shoulder before sitting down. She pulled out her phone and showed me screenshots she'd taken of Harris's personnel file when she was covering a shift in records. There were 3 sealed complaints from women who'd reported being groped or propositioned during arrests, plus 2 more for making sexual comments to female suspects. She said the department buried these every time because the women were usually drunk or had criminal records, so nobody believed them. She deleted the photos from her phone right after showing me, saying she could lose her job or worse if anyone found out she'd accessed sealed files. The next morning, Matthew called to confirm what Rosa had shown me was real, but said getting official access to those sealed complaints would need approval from the police chief himself. The system was designed to protect cops like Harris by making it nearly impossible to prove patterns of behavior. He said my recording was the first solid evidence they'd had that couldn't be explained away or buried. Later that week, Bianca came back from a department leadership meeting looking frustrated and angry. She told me the deputy district attorney had suggested I should consider dropping the complaint for the good of office relations with the police. Bianca had pushed back hard, reminding them that officers had stolen money from me and threatened false charges, but several people in the meeting thought I was making too big a deal out of it. She said she'd keep fighting, but warned me that I was becoming isolated in the office. Through public records requests that Tanner filed, we got maintenance logs for the police station and found something suspicious. The security cameras had gone into maintenance mode at 11:47 p.m., just 8 minutes before I'd walked in after the robbery. The maintenance was manually triggered from the watch commander's computer, not an automatic system update like they'd claimed. Someone had deliberately turned off those cameras. A week later, I got forwarded a police union email that had gone out to all members. It called me an anti-cop prosecutor who was trying to destroy good officers over a misunderstanding. The email suggested that officers should think carefully before cooperating with any cases I was involved in. Within days, I noticed officers at the courthouse would turn away when they saw me coming or whisper to each other as I passed. The ones I'd worked with before on cases suddenly became cold and formal, giving me only the bare minimum information I needed. Tanner sat me down in his office with a thick folder of similar cases and explained the reality of suing the police. He said civil lawsuits typically took 2 to 3 years minimum and would cost at least $20,000 in legal fees and depositions. We talked about getting funding from civil rights organizations or doing a contingency fee arrangement where he'd take a percentage of any settlement. Despite the long timeline and high costs, I decided to move forward because letting them get away with it would mean they'd keep doing it to other women. Matthew discovered something else during his investigation that made everything worse. Department policy required all officers to activate body cameras before any citizen interaction, but both Harris and Mitchell had kept theirs turned off during my entire visit. When Matthew pulled their camera logs, it showed they'd both manually deactivated them right before bringing me to the interview room. This wasn't just misconduct anymore. It was a deliberate pattern of covering their tracks. I spent a whole weekend writing an op-ed about police accountability and what happened to me, laying out how the system protects bad cops and punishes victims who speak up. But after talking with Bianca and Tanner, I decided not to publish it yet because it might hurt the investigation and give the union ammunition to claim I was biased. Keeping quiet when I wanted to scream the truth to everyone was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. Finally, 6 weeks after everything started, we got notice that an administrative hearing date had been set. Bianca, Tanner, and I started meeting twice a week to prepare my testimony and go over all the evidence we'd collected. We practiced hostile questioning where they'd attack my credibility and try to trip me up on details. Having structure and a clear date to work toward helped with the anxiety, even though I felt sick every time I thought about facing Harris and Mitchell again in that hearing room. 2 days before the hearing, my phone buzzed with a text from Rosa saying she'd been stuck with midnight shifts all week since talking to the investigators. She wrote that other officers were giving her the cold shoulder, and she was thinking about backing out of testifying. I felt sick reading her message because she was risking her whole career to help me. I texted back that I understood if she needed to protect herself, but thanked her for everything she'd already done. That same night, I spread all my evidence across my dining room table and started building a huge binder with tabs for each policy violation. I printed transcripts of the recording with timestamps highlighted in yellow marker next to the exact department policies they broke. My hands kept shaking as I organized everything, but having a task to focus on helped calm my nerves. Bianca came over to help me practice answering hostile questions, and we went through every possible attack they might throw at me. She pretended to be the union lawyer and asked me why I didn't immediately identify myself as a prosecutor if I wasn't trying to trap them. We practiced my answer 20 times until I could say it without my voice cracking. The next morning, a courier delivered an official envelope from the police department's legal team. Inside was a settlement offer for $15,000, but it came with a non-disclosure agreement that would prevent me from ever talking about what happened. I called Bianca immediately and told her there was no way I'd sign something that let them sweep this under the rug. She agreed completely and said silence would just let them keep doing this to other women. 3 days later, I walked into the administrative hearing room wearing my most conservative suit with my binder clutched against my chest. Harris and Mitchell sat at a table across the room in their dress uniforms, looking straight ahead without acknowledging me. My legs felt weak as I took my seat at the witness table, but I forced myself to sit up straight. The hearing officer asked me to state my name for the record, and my voice came out as barely a whisper at first. I cleared my throat and started again, louder this time, telling my story from the beginning. As I described walking into the station after being robbed, my voice got stronger and steadier with each word. I played the recording through the room's speakers and watched Harris's jaw clench when his voice filled the room saying I was dressed like I was for sale. Mitchell shifted in his seat when we got to the part where he pocketed my $20. After my testimony, Matthew took the stand and laid out his investigation findings in careful detail. He confirmed that both officers violated the body camera policy by manually turning them off before our interaction. He showed logs proving the desk sergeant never called for a supervisor despite policy requiring it for assault victims. The union lawyer tried to argue that the officers were just doing their job, but Matthew had documentation for every single violation. During a break, Rosa found me in the hallway and handed me a manila envelope with printed text messages inside. The messages showed other officers joking in a group chat about teaching the uppity prosecutor a lesson and making sure I knew my place. Rosa's hands were shaking as she gave them to me, and I squeezed her arm in thanks before she hurried away. When we went back in, I submitted the texts as evidence and watched the hearing officer's face get harder as she read through them. Her eyebrows pulled together when she got to the part where someone wrote that they should have arrested me just to see how I liked being in cuffs. After 2 more hours of testimony and arguments, the hearing officer announced she was ready to issue her findings. She sustained violations for conduct unbecoming an officer, failure to activate body cameras, theft of property, and 2 other policy breaches. 2 charges about improper detention weren't proven, but we'd won on the major points that mattered most. The union representative immediately stood up and announced they'd be filing an appeal within the hour. By the end of the day, both Harris and Mitchell were suspended with pay pending the arbitration process. It made me angry that they were still getting their paychecks, but at least they couldn't hurt anyone else while suspended. The next week, my supervisor called me into her office to discuss a reassignment to the white-collar crime unit. She framed it as a promotion with better hours and more interesting cases, but we both knew it was really about keeping me away from patrol officers. The white-collar unit meant dealing with federal agents and forensic accountants instead of street cops who might hold a grudge. I accepted the transfer because it was actually a step up, even if the reason behind it made me mad. Tanner called that afternoon to tell me he'd filed our civil lawsuit against the city and department. Within 3 days, the city attorney's office sent over their first settlement offer of $10,000. Tanner laughed when he read it to me over the phone and said they were testing to see if I'd go away cheap. We rejected it immediately and started preparing for what we both knew would be a long fight ahead. The victim services coordinator called me 2 days later with news that made me actually cry with relief, because they'd approved coverage for both my therapy sessions and the entire emergency room bill from that night. I filled out their paperwork at my kitchen table, my hands steady now as I wrote down every detail they needed, checking boxes about the type of crime and attaching copies of the police report I'd finally managed to file at a different precinct. The approval letter came within a week, and I tucked it into the folder with all my other documentation, grateful that at least the financial burden wouldn't crush me while I fought everything else. Meanwhile, the original robbery case sat untouched in some filing cabinet because Harris and Mitchell had been too busy humiliating me to actually investigate anything that night. I called the detective assigned to it, and he admitted they had no leads, no witness canvases done, no security footage pulled from nearby buildings, nothing that should have been done in those first critical hours. The anger burned in my chest as I realized the man who attacked me was still out there, probably hurting other women, all because 2 cops decided I deserved what happened to me based on my dress. 3 weeks later, I had to walk past that same corner to get to a deposition, and my whole body started shaking before I even got close. My therapist had taught me to count 5 things I could see, 4 I could touch, 3 I could hear, 2 I could smell, 1 I could taste, and I stood there on the sidewalk doing exactly that while people walked around me. I saw the coffee shop sign, the bus stop bench, a woman with a red coat, construction cones, a delivery truck, then touched my purse strap, the building wall, my phone case, my jacket zipper, while my breathing slowly returned to normal. The panic still came, but I got through it, made it to my deposition, did my job even though my legs felt weak the whole time. Bianca called me into her office the next morning and asked if I'd help develop a training program for our prosecutors about trauma-informed victim interaction and recognizing police misconduct. She handed me a draft outline she'd started, and I spent the rest of the day adding sections about power dynamics, victim blaming, and the specific tactics bad cops use to silence people. We scheduled the first training for the following month, and I threw myself into preparing materials, finding research studies, creating scenarios based on real cases including my own. Rosa texted me that afternoon saying she'd just filed her own retaliation complaint because they'd moved her to midnight shifts in the worst district after she'd given that statement about the text messages. We met for coffee and she showed me the documentation she'd been keeping. Every schedule change, every hostile interaction, every time someone accidentally forgot to tell her about a meeting. I helped her organize everything chronologically and gave her Tanner's number in case she needed a lawyer too. She squeezed my hand across the table and said, having someone who understood made it bearable. 2 days later, the police chief held a press conference announcing new mandatory policies about victim treatment and body camera requirements that would start immediately. The reporters asked if it was related to any specific incidents, and he gave vague answers about ongoing improvements while our civil case churned through depositions and motions in the background. I watched the conference from my office and felt both vindicated and exhausted, because real change shouldn't require someone to nearly destroy their career to make it happen. That weekend, I had a security company come install cameras at my apartment, one at the front door, one covering the parking area, another watching the back entrance. The installer showed me how to check the feeds on my phone, and I spent an hour that night going through all my social media accounts, making everything private, removing location tags from old posts, unfriending people I didn't really know. Setting these boundaries made me feel like I had some control back, even if I still jumped every time I heard footsteps behind me at night. My therapist said that was normal and would fade with time, but taking active steps to protect myself was healthy. 3 months after everything started, I walked past the police station on my way to the courthouse for a completely different case. The new desk sergeant, a woman who'd been transferred in after the policy changes, looked up as I passed and gave me a respectful nod that felt like acknowledgement of everything that had happened. I nodded back and kept walking, my steps firm and confident now, surrounded by allies like Bianca, and Rosa and Tanner, knowing that speaking truth to power had cost me sleepless nights and panic attacks, but had also made me stronger than I'd ever been before. Thanks for sticking with me through all my questions and wonderings. It's always so interesting exploring this stuff together. Until we meet again, take care. Subscribe for more content like this.